And Mr. Reuter's fiscal plan is after that tab. All right. So we're going to jump in to the 2024 budget. So I'd like to start off a little bit talking about the budget adoption calendar. We have to follow certain timeline when we do our budget every year through the DLGF. So on August 25th, we published that Form 3 Notice to Taxpayers on the Gateway website. And then on August 28th, we published our capital expenditures plan and our bus replacement plan. We uploaded those into Gateway, and we published them on the school website as well. There is no requirement for publishing in the newspaper anymore. That ended about 3 or 4 years ago, I think. Now we just put everything on that Gateway public site. On September 20th, tonight, we have our board work session, and we'll hold our public hearing for our budgeted funds as well as the capital and bus replacement plans. And then October 9th will be the official budget adoption and the adoption of the capital expenditures plan, the bus replacement plan, and several resolutions that have to be adopted as well. And then October 10th, because everything's approved, I will then turn around and we will submit all the required documents to the DLGF so they can work on our budget for hopefully fairly early approval. They have to approve by December 31st for our budget to go into play on January 1st, 2024. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some realities that we're facing at West Lafayette Community Schools. Our state funding this year is increasing by $369.96 per student for the 23-24 school year. So even though we're down by a few students this year, our basic state tuition support funding is actually going up because that was a fairly large increase for this year. Now, we will not have that next year. Next year, it's only expected to increase by about $94 per student. So we definitely won't see the increase in state tuition support next year that we will see this year. When we advertise for a budget, we use a different AV than the actual certified, as DLGF representatives always tell us to advertise high, because that is the absolute maximum we can get. We want to make sure we get what we want, so we advertise high. So in our budgeted funds, we typically use a smaller AV because that draws the tax rate up, because we want what we want, okay? For referendum, I believe we used a higher amount because we want to get the full 37 cents per $1,000 of assessed value for our referendum fund, okay? So as I said, AV increases for our district are fairly high compared to other districts across the state. We did finally receive our certified AVs after the budget was published. I was waiting for it, and we finally got it about the second week of September. We're seeing an 8.1% increase for the Operations Fund and Debt Service Fund AV from last year, and a 12.96% increase in the Referendum Fund AV from last year. So those are pretty good increases. You can see our AV is now $1.262 billion for operations and debt and $2.159 billion for referendum. There's a difference because the TIF district AV is included in the referendum AV. So you can see how much the TIF districts actually bring in there. Okay. So something else to kind of put everything into perspective. Our total teacher compensation is just roughly looking at our contracts, and the benefits for 22-23 was approximately $14.5 million for the school year. Our basic grant state tuition support was $14.8 million. So this is another factor as to why our referendum funds come in handy for West Lafayette schools, okay? I want to talk a little bit about each fund and what it's used for, what you can use it for, and then we'll break it down into revenue and expenditures really quick so you can see what that budget looks like. But the education fund, when you look at reports, is 101. It's mainly funded by state tuition support, which is our ADM funding, other state payments, and other miscellaneous revenue. Our transfer tuition from TSC goes into the education fund, any interest that we receive, as well as any reimbursements that we might get into the fund. Our state code also allows us to transfer up to 15% from the education fund to the operations fund. We have not had to do that, not saying that we may not need to do that into the future. And I believe Mr. Reuter will go over some of those possibilities in his presentation here in a little bit. Okay. Any expenses in the education fund are related to educational programs or what the state deems as educational programs. So salaries and benefits for teachers, school building administration, paraprofessionals, special education, library, guidance, nursing, things like that. any supplies, fees, and contracted services for the classroom, and any instructional technology. So our building computer techs, computers we buy for students, computers we buy for teachers, any software that we use in the classroom can all go through the education fund. So breaking down our budget for the education fund, this is our revenue that we've projected. Revenue codes in the 1300s include transfer tuition from individuals and schools, and so that's where our TSC transfer amounts fall. So we bill for our prior year students based upon prior year expenditures in the fall, and we usually receive that by the end of December. So last year's students will be billed at using last year's expenditures. We should receive that by December for 2023. And so then 23-24 we'll do next fall and receive by next December. Okay. I think we are looking at, what was the projection that we used for that? About 140 something? How many students did we project for this amount? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes. Yep. It's a significant chunk of change. Yes. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. 1500s include our interest off of investments, which we've been very lucky. We're earning quite a bit of money off of our investments, so we're projecting about $450,000 for 2024. So that helps fund our classrooms. 1700s are the receipts of educationally related fees. 1900s include miscellaneous revenue and reimbursements, such as when the ECA has to reimburse us for like ticket takers and things like that we run through payroll. And the 3000s include state payments such as the basic grant and summer school reimbursement. So you can see for 3000s, we're estimating about $16.8 million for a calendar year 2024. Remember that we are funded on a fiscal year basis by the state, but we budget for a calendar year. So 2 different school years are going into this formula. Okay, so there's a lot of assumptions we have to make when we're budgeting. As far as expenditures, I've broken it down by major program codes and then the actual objects. So for educational programs, we have about $12.8 million. For support services in the education fund, which includes guidance counselors, library, things like that, about $4.9 million. Athletic coaches, $413,500. Total expenditures of $18.145 million. Please note, when you look over at the object balances, salaries and wages and benefits make up about 92% of the total budget for the education fund. So we are actually a little bit higher than a lot of other places that I've seen, but we also have the referendum fund that helps with that as well. Okay. All right, moving on to debt service fund. So in the debt service fund, we get revenue mainly from our property taxes. The levy, which is the tax amount, is equal to the amount we need to pay in bond and lease payments, plus any carryover for the next year's payments. And that's a calculation that's done by the DLGF. We can only get what we need to pay plus that carryover. Carryover is 15% of total payments for the subsequent budget year, or the first payment, whichever is less, and they calculate all of that when we enter our debt service into Gateway. Expenses are purely for those payments that need to be made during the budget year. Things like general obligation bonds, lease rental agreements, interest on short-term debt if we needed to do a tax anticipation warrant. Hopefully we don't need to do one of those ever again. And common school fund loan repayments. So looking at our revenue and expenditures for debt service, we're looking at approximately $7 million, which that's advertised high for budget purposes, and local taxes of about $281,000 for total revenue of $6.9 million. And our estimated circuit breaker loss that will be applied after we get a waiver from protected taxes to debt service will be about $733,000, okay? We will be eligible for our protected taxes waiver for calendar year 2024, which helps keep money into our operations fund, because our operations fund expenditures don't go down. They just keep going up every year because of inflation, and I think things like that actually go up in price even faster than everything else, so. All right, operations fund. This is also funded mainly by property taxes and other miscellaneous taxes and facility rental. Or if we have transfers from the education fund, they could also go into the operations fund. Expenses are mainly for operations of the school corporation that support the learning process. So things like maintenance of buildings, grounds, and facilities, equipment. Central office operations are included here and paid from here. Utilities, administrative and operational technology, so like the IT infrastructure, the servers, the firewall, things like that. Facilities and land acquisition and improvements, transportation expenses, and the purchase of buses can all go under the operations fund. Yeah.
31. Is that before the 733,023?
Is that for what?
Okay, so you estimated the circuit breaker loss will be applied after the waiver.
I have not applied the waiver to any of that.
Okay, so that's the gross, and then the waiver comes
That's
off.
our projected budgeted revenue,
Okay.
which is actually high.
Okay, so the 733 comes off of it. Got it.
Yep.
Thank you. I don't think that's clear by looking at the slide.
All right.
Sure, it's clear.
So the Form 3, we can include some circuit breaker as part of our Form 4B when we advertise the budget. We put a little bit. I don't think we included all of it when we advertised for the budget. You can determine an amount to use when you actually advertise, and we don't know what the actual is going to be until, unfortunately, everything is certified. So, okay, operations fund revenue. Once again, we're advertising high at $4.5 million. The state actually has a formula that sets what our maximum levy is in operations fund, and that's actually 4.228. We want to make sure we get that maximum amount, though, so we advertise a higher amount to make sure that we get that amount. All right. Local taxes, other fees, and then other local revenue for a total revenue of about 4.5. But once again, we're going to have that protected taxes waiver. So we should be able to apply some to the operations fund. So our total revenue is actually closer to 3.9 million when all is said and done after the protected taxes waiver and circuit breaker. Budgeted expenditures for the operations fund. Our major program codes are $20,000 for support services. That includes central office, maintenance, custodial, and transportation. So that's about 4.7 million. So just keep in mind our total revenue is looking at about 3.9. Total support services about 4.7. Okay. 30,000 operations, our lunch aides and our pool personnel, that's about $211,000. And then the 40,000 building and land improvements. So if we have to do any renovation projects or improvements, things like that, I'm budgeting about $650,000. So our total budget expenditures is about 5.5 million, and we're looking at getting about 3.9. So more than likely we will dip into our cash balance in the operations fund this year, in 2024. Okay. And then broken down, we do have some salaries and wages in operations fund. A good chunk of it is for purchase services and utilities. Utilities cost quite a bit, and they don't ever go down. They always go up. So. And lastly, we have the operating referendum fund that is solely funded by our property taxes. It taxes the TIF district AV, unlike our debt service and our operations fund. Used to fund items outlined in our revenue spending plan, which we passed at our referendum approval meeting. We pay for things such as salaries and benefits of our teaching staff from here, and operational expenditures that support learning, so our custodial maintenance salaries, wages, and benefits. Maintenance contracted services and supplies, transportation salaries, wages, and benefits, any transportation expenses related to our bus maintenance as we contract with TSC to take care of our buses, and any purchase of buses as well. Revenue budget, or advertising high at 8.14 million. Local taxes of 301,000. So total revenue budget of 8.441 million. More likely that number is going to be close to about 7.98. Okay. But remember, we're advertising high to make sure we get the highest that we want. Budgeted expenditures for operations broken down between educational and then our support services. So 5.339 for educational, 3.268 for our support services. We tried to, since it's a little bit more revenue than what we looked at in our revenue spending plan, we tried to keep about the same percentage breakdown as we had in that revenue spending plan between the two. Okay. So salaries and wages make up about 5.63 million of that, with about 2 million going to benefits. So about 65% of the referendum fund revenue will be going towards salaries and benefits for 2024. Okay. And then I just want to touch on rainy day really quick. It's funded by our historical transfers into the fund from other funds. Our current balance in the rainy day fund is $1.2 million. It can be used to fund any expenses made during the operation of a school district as long as it's budgeted. And so we are proposing to have that budgeted in case some things come up in support services and facilities of about $817,000. And this is just in case we need it. Because if you have to do an additional appropriation, that's a 2-month process. So we're going to appropriate it now so that we have it there if we need it. Okay. All right. Final comments. So while the state does not think of us as a complex district, we don't get a lot of complexity funding, we actually are a very complex district. As you can see, we have a lot of different things going on. We deal with that on a daily basis. Not only is our funding from the state limited, our tax revenue is also limited due to a number of factors, including limited growth in our housing in this district and the large amount of AV caught up in our TIF districts. You can see that by looking at our AV for the referendum fund versus the other funds. Okay. Being that we're in a city, we also have a larger number of taxing units that make up our total tax rate. Thus, our total tax rates are higher, leading to higher circuit breaker for us. This literally means we get less money in our operations fund. Doesn't diminish what we have to pay for from the operations fund, but we get less money in our operations fund. And then our referendum dollars allow us to maintain our current programs and offer competitive wages and benefits to our employees. So that just lends to our complexity. So, President Witt, would you like to open the hearing for the public, please?
I will do that. So we are required to hold a public hearing, and that is what we are doing here tonight. I'm opening this for the West Lafayette Community School Corporation 2024 budget, and then I will open for public comment. I did not have anyone who signed up for public comment this evening. Are you the public tonight? Would you like to okay. So we have no public comment, and I will then close the floor for public comments. And with that, I will move on to item 5, a presentation of the West Lafayette Community School Corporation fiscal plan with Mr. Mike Reuter.
Thank you very much. And if you don't mind driving from there, and I'll refer to a page number. You have a hard copy in the back of your binder. That will be the real page number for you, but for the PDF, you always have to add 2 pages. So if I say page 10, you have to page 12 in the PDF.
And if I hate to do this to you, but I do need you to use a microphone, please,
Okay.
if you don't mind.
I don't mind at all. So Michelle and I have been working together on the 2024 budget, and she's discussed much of the things that are already included in the fiscal plan. But I'm gonna back up a minute and talk a little bit about the legislative session as well. This last spring was a long session in which they determined the funding formula for the next 2 years. But they also spent a lot of time talking about property tax and trying to limit the impact of property tax in 2024. And they took some actions in the House that were rather drastic early on. But when it got over to the Senate, things were softened, but we still lost some revenue as a result of that. And I'm going to show you where we lost that revenue. They also increased the supplemental homestead deduction from 35% to 40%. That ultimately affected your assessed valuation that was certified. So what Michelle shared with you on the assessed valuation is actually artificially low, because of that additional supplemental homestead deduction that they implemented. So, and I'll show you those as we go through the fiscal plan. I'm going to start on page 48. And Michelle's already talked a little bit about student enrollment, but obviously we have not had our official ADM count date, but I'm using what we know best today, and that is an enrollment of 2,213 students. Now that does not include the transfer students from Tippecanoe schools. This is what's just included in the funding formula. And so I use this to calculate the funding formula. And I had McKibben's numbers in there going forward, but I've moved away from them because we were much lower in 2023 than what was anticipated. And so I've gone back to using an average. I've used his kindergarten number for the base, but then I've gone back to an average. Yes.
I just want to clarify for anybody who would be watching the live stream, you're referring to Mr. McKibben, who performed our demographic study
Correct.
previously. That's
Correct.
the study that you're talking about when you say McKibben.
Yes, I'm sorry.
That's all. That's okay. We're going to get that question
apologize.
later.
I forgot that this is a
Yeah.
live stream. So yes, Dr. McKibben performed a demographic study. I am using his kindergarten number, but I've gone back to some averages that I've used in the past. I'm not a demographer, but since we're lower in enrollment, we don't want to use a higher enrollment forecasting revenue going into the future. So I've lowered that as our new base. And so if I use my averages, again, not a demographic study, but if I use my averages, use his kindergarten number, it seems like enrollment will stabilize. We might lose a few more yet in the future, just as those cohorts move through, and that's how my averages work. I look at the cohorts and how they move through the enrollments, and so I'm using a little different numbers than what he has. So I would say these are probably more conservative, if being the case. In other words, the revenue would be more conservative. I hope his numbers come back up. And so what's so important about this number is this drives your funding formula. And we're going to talk about the funding formula in a minute, but this is the beginning point of trying to determine how much revenue you're going to get from the state. So it's a big piece of the model. And you're funded by the number of students you have, no matter whether that goes up or down. It's not a base funding. If your enrollment goes down, you get funding for less students. You get the increase in the foundation, but you lose the money for the students that are not here, and vice versa. If you grow, you'll get additional funding back. So I've gone with a little more conservative estimates on the enrollment. I'm going to go to page 13 now and go back to the assessed valuation, and just a little different look. And if you could zoom in just a little bit more on that. Oops. So just kind of looking at the last few years, we were thrilled to see this year's assessed valuation get certified at 8.1% for your net assessed valuation, and a referendum assessed valuation up almost 13%. And you've had good growth in the 2 years prior to that. On your net AV, though, if you go back just not that long ago, in 2021, that AV was only growing about 3.3%. And so to see 8.1% growth, even considering that the state increased the supplemental homestead deduction to 40%, that's probably artificially low by at least 5% on the net AV. So you grew more than 8%, but it was back down because of the supplemental homestead deduction. So you lost that ability, obviously, to be able to tax on that. Now, for some, that won't matter. If you're at the circuit breaker, you may calculate a higher supplemental homestead deduction, but you may not get the benefit of it. But if you aren't at the circuit breaker, you'll have the benefit of that additional supplemental homestead deduction, but it did affect your assessed valuation. Now, we'll have some baked-in growth in the next 2 years, but I've gone pretty conservative with that estimate by only using 4% the next 2 years. And the reason it's baked in is because the supplemental homestead deduction is going to go from 40% to 37.5%, and then back down to 35%. So we have some growth coming in back on our assessed valuation. As long as that holds and the legislators don't change that, that's what's on the books right now. So that's kind of important that we're going to see some growth in at least the next 2 years. So the referendum AV was just very strong. So the next page, and you've heard me mention this before, and it's a mouthful, but this is what's called the 6-year non-farm personal income factor. One more page, please. And this calculation has been used for a number of years to calculate how much your levy would go up each year, your property tax levy. And in your case, this is all referring to the levy of the operations fund. And this year, in a way to try and limit the amount of property tax units will collect, they basically put a conditional statement in. They said, basically, calculate the 6-year non-farm personal income factor like you always do. But if it's more than 4%, you're only getting 4%. And we would have gotten closer to 5% had that not been put in place. So we lost about 1% there. That's in play for 2 more years, okay? And so this doesn't matter whether you live north, south, east, or west. This factor is used for counties, cities, towns, townships, libraries. And so everyone was pretty much limited to 4% from what I can tell for the next 2 years. And then it goes back, and then it goes off the books again, and we go back up to an estimate of about 5% a couple of years from now. So going to page 23, you'll see this new calculation. And you can see that I've bolded off the page there. You basically start with your prior year maximum levy for operations. You take it by 4%, and that becomes your new number. So Michelle had shared with you what we've advertised, but that's not what we're going to collect. This is the maximum levy that the DLGF is going to allow. The reason you use a lower assessed valuation, you can always come down, you can't go up. And even the DLGF recommends that because there's times people have used the actual certified AV in their budget process and they dialed their rates in on that and you think you're safe, but then they recertify assessed valuations for some reason and it's lower, then you've adopted rates that are too low and you can't collect them. So it tends to be part of the process. It's a very common process with governmental units to advertise high and we are limited in what we're going to collect. The DLGF in their review process then brings those numbers back down. Page 18, now you might have to get really tiny glasses to see this, but maybe up on the screen you might see it better. If you could zoom in on this and go to the left. Now down just a little bit. Yeah, thank you. So this is what's called the foundation. I've bolded off the page with that foundation. This is what they adopted in the budget this year. And so for 2023-24, that foundation amount is $6,590. And so the foundation is up 5.69%. In 24-25, it is only up 1.38%. So they did front load the formula. And so I think most people are trying to use those dollars to increase salaries this year, but next year across the state, schools are going to have near the amount of revenue that they've seen in the last few years. And so this number then that you see here, again, this is another, it doesn't matter what type of district you are or the complexity of it. It doesn't matter whether you're southern Indiana or northern Indiana or central Indiana. Every student gets started with this base funding. And then if you go down one more page for me. Down, yeah, right there to the right there. Then there's a complexity grant that is calculated, and those grants went up 5.51 and 1.03. So if you go to the right there, you would see that you get a few $100s more on top of that foundation where others might be getting thousands of dollars more. Complexity essentially means and they don't use the term free lunch anymore, but it represents the complexity, the free and reduced lunch population of your district. And so for those such as an Indianapolis Public Schools, they get a high adjustment for complexity. Where you have low complexity, you get fewer dollars from that. And that's why you see a lot of districts with low complexities all have referendums, because they're not getting near as much on that complexity amount. So now going to page 1, we're going to go back now and we'll just kind of plow through the forecast. And Michelle's already touched on this. This is the education fund, formerly known in 2018 as the general fund, but now as the education fund. But I want to go back and remind everyone we went through a pretty significant transition from 22 to 23. And I've bolded some numbers off of the page here where you see like our regular programs went from 12,175,000 down to about 9.9. Now our expenses really didn't decrease, but what you had been doing prior to that is transferring money out of the referendum fund into the education fund. And that was fine. I'm not saying that was wrong. But then the law changed and said, hey, when you pass a referendum, you have to have a revenue spending plan, and you have to show what you're spending that on. So we had to go through a pretty significant budget structure change in the 23 budget. So our expenses really didn't drop. If you scroll down just a little bit further, please. Yeah, right there. You could see I bolded off the page the 3.5 million in the year before that was transferred into this fund, and that goes away. And then we also changed some things where we moved more expense out of the education fund to the referendum fund, out of the to move some of the cash back into your education fund to rebalance some of your cash balances between referendum and education. And so we went through some pretty significant changes there. In 2023, a couple things have happened here. It's showing our budget in balance by about $1.7 million. Last year, when the tuition was billed to Tippecanoe Schools, the payment didn't get received until January. So there's about $469,000 inflating that number in 2023. So it's not like we're really collecting that much. So there's some one-time revenue that should have been put in 22 that got put in 23. But also another thing that units are seeing, higher interest rates are not good for homeowners, but we're seeing higher interest rates on our cash balances. And so our interest just in 2021 was $93,465. And now in 24's budget, we've increased that, and including 23, to closer to $450,000. So suddenly you're picking up new revenue off of interest income. Now I caution people with that because it's real money and you really use it. But you got to be careful about building fixed costs on it going forward, because going back to 2008, you can all remember when we had the crash, rates were great. Everybody was getting good money market rates and CD rates were good. And then bam, it went down to 0.1% and stayed there for a long time. So in this model, what I've done is I've assumed higher interest income for 2023 and 2024. But then I started to back that interest estimate down again in 25 and 26, because when you look at some of the treasuries out there, that's kind of what they're indicating, that rates are, Brad, you probably see that, that rates are strong yet. They don't anticipate those decreases come soon, but could be coming again. And so whether that really happens or not, I don't know. I think everybody would like to know the answer to that, but that's what it's showing. And I caution you because what it's doing, it's inflating our revenues right now, because we're getting much more interest off than we've gotten in the past. So that's good news. That's not a bad news thing, but a caution. So we did gain in our cash balance at the end of 22, we're at $2,756,000, which was up from $2,000,002 the year before. Now this year we should see a pretty big bump with the interest income, and again that one-time revenue that should have been in 22. And so we'll end up closer to 26% cash balance in this fund, what I'm anticipating at the end of 23. And at a minimum, I've shared this with you before, you really don't want to see that ever get below 8.33%. And the reason being is that's 1 month. You get nice equal monthly distributions from the state, but there was a year we got cut mid-year, actually the first month of our budget cycle, and you needed to have cash on hand to deal with that. So this builds that up. Now, this is important because I'm going to talk about this later. Right now, I am not showing any transfer out of this fund, but I think we may have to consider it in the future. The state, Michelle mentioned this in her presentation, the state allows you to transfer up to 15% of your state funding to the operations fund. And most districts that do not have referendum funds have to do that. And a lot of them go right up to the 15%. You can actually go over the 15%, but it's kind of like they don't want you to go over 15%. You have to disclose that you're over 15%. But it's important to note, I haven't built this in here yet because I wanted to show you the operations fund and the debt service fund, because the debt service fund and the operations fund are going to come into play in the conversation of having to transfer money out of here in the future. So the next page, please, page 2. Now, this is confusing. You have been applying for the waiver to reallocate your circuit breaker loss, which Michelle referred to. You lose about 33% of every dollar you try to levy on your operations fund. And so you've been appealing to take that 30% and reallocate a portion of it to the debt service fund. And so that's left extra dollars in your operations fund. But what I'm seeing this year, because our assessed valuation has grown, that the DLGF is actually going to decrease our debt service rate this year because it's grown so much in the last 2 years. I'm going to show you those rates in a minute. And I'm not sure you want that to happen. And what that does is it create an opportunity for you to issue debt to get back up to that 0.5375 rate that we've managed to. And if you do that, the new law this year says, if you are a waiver district and you issue any new debt, you lose that transferability. So we think that you will we know you will qualify for this again in 24, but they're decreasing our debt rate. And the reason being is they don't recognize the circuit breaker loss in their calculations, and that's how it happens. It was discussed about, well, we advertise this high levy, but we don't come even close to collecting that because of the circuit breaker transfer that we have been making. But this year, we're getting to the point that the 15% operating balance that Michelle referred to, when they run their calculations and back out the effects of circuit breaker, we go over that. And if we go over the 15%, they start reducing our rate. And so it's a very confusing calculation. But all I can tell you is what I'm seeing is that we're going to see that probably drop close to our rate go from 53.75 to 49 cents on the debt service fund. But you're also going to see then a significant hit on your operations fund. Because we see this, you see I bolded off the top of the page there that I anticipate about $733,000 of the circuit breaker loss to be taken in this fund. And what we've been doing is taking that and we've been able to replace it with revenue. We have the old 2017 bonds that have some cash in them, and we've been able to make up, and so we have enough for the payments with those 17 bonds. So, but then going forward, you see that goes away, but you see that I've actually projected to increase your payment from $6,104,000 to $7,140,000. And so that gets the rate back up to 0.5375. And the reason that would be important is because we will want to look for places in our operations fund for equipment and or improvements that can be paid with a bond. And so essentially what you would do, you'll lose dollars in the operations fund, and we'll try to find some expenses within the operations fund that we can bond for. And so it's just a different way of collecting those dollars. But if we do issue more bonds, we will lose the waiver transfer, and that's a pretty big hit on the operations fund. And so go to page 43. It ties back to this. One more, back one page the other way. I'm sorry. There you go, right there. So I've bolded off the page here that maintaining a flat tax rate, assumption of my 4% growth in assessed valuation for the next 2 years, and getting the rate back to 0.5375, you could have an additional payment of $1 million in 25 and 1.5 million. Now that's payment, okay? That's not net proceeds. That's principal and interest payment. So that's what I would anticipate would be available. But keep in mind, we're losing $700 and some thousand of operations money. So that's the assessed valuation growth. We want that to keep going now. I mean, we will want that to keep growing going forward. Once we lose that waiver, we're going to want that AV to grow as fast as we can get it to grow. So again, this is not all new dollars, because we'd probably try to use some of these to replace expenses that are in the operations fund. In addition to that, if we do a bond, we do have those 17 bonds out there, the balance in the 17 bonds, and I don't recall off the top of my head where we're at on that. Yeah, I know that I had it in my previous fiscal plan, but we might have to use some of those yet this year, not a lot this year, and some next year based on the DLGF calculation. But then we won't have to use any of those dollars, and so that balance becomes available, but it's earmarked for a bond payment. So you could issue more bonds and use that 2017 money to pay off a bond, if that makes sense. So in addition to that, I don't have that built in here. I'm just showing you what on purely a tax rate. But so when we size the bond, that would be a different conversation. Do we want to just size it to keep the debt rate flat? Or do we want to size it to keep the debt rate flat and then also pull in those old 2017 balances to use on projects? So I apologize. That is very confusing, but it is how the law is structured. And so it is just how I'm anticipating this to go through their calculations this year. Okay, let's go back now to page 7. Michelle's already said this, but this pays for your support services, buses, utilities, maintenance, hit hard by inflation, cost beyond your control. But the most important thing here on this page is when you look at the revenue for 24, that levy is up 4%. The levy's up 4% in 25, then it goes up 5%. But look at the number right below it, going from losing only $568,000 in the operations fund, we go to losing $1,353,000 in that fund because we lose that transferability. And so what it does, if you would scroll down to the bottom of this page, I think we will be out of balance this year based on our spending pattern this year. We'll probably use some of our cash. I show the balance, in balance next year. We always want to try to spend to our revenue, no matter what we have budgeted. Michelle said, we advertise high. We want to try to spend our revenue if we can. We might, if we do these bonds in 24, we can reimburse ourselves for some of those costs in the 24 budget for some of those things that we might be able to move this next year. But then you can see the budget, if we continue with that same pattern, just the base budget of about $4 million, you can see how out of balance that budget is in 25 and 26, and we would run out of cash very quickly. So goes back to my transfer comment earlier about the education fund. A lot of districts transfer money out of there. It's not a shameful thing to do that. But we might have to transfer some dollars out of the education fund, maybe move as much expense as we can out to a bond, short-term bonds, short-term obligation bonds. And then whatever we can't move, we may have to consider a transfer from the education fund to the operations fund to balance it. So we have these silos of money, but they all tie together. It's like if you do this happens. And so it's gotten, as Michelle said, it's gotten very complex. Let me see if there's anything else. A couple more things. You could see here that in 22, we were transferred $3.5 million of the operations or of the referendum fund into operations like we were doing in the education fund. That stopped as well. And we moved some of these expenses. The expenses actually decreased in this fund as well because we moved some of those expenses then to the referendum fund. Now, at the end of the year, I'm showing that, if we spend about $500,000 more than we take in, that we'd end the year with approximately $2.2 million. And that's a good number because if you scroll up just a little bit higher, this is an informal recommendation. But I always like to see about 50 in the year with 50% of your next year's property tax collections. And the reason being is we don't get property tax on monthly distributions. We get property tax in June and December. So when you close a year, you need cash in the bank to get you through till you get your next property tax settlement. So if you got $2.2 million at the end of 23, that's more than 50% of your next year's property tax. The problem is you see where that cash balance is going if we don't do something different. We would not have as much money, and then at some point you would have to borrow from another fund, i.e. rainy day, or you'd have to borrow from the education fund, or if you didn't have funds there, then you'd have to go to tax anticipation warrants. We're not close to that yet, but that's another option, is to issue tax anticipation warrants. We will hopefully always keep you out of that situation. but that is when you get really tight on cash flow. Okay. Not much to say. Page 8, Michelle's already touched on this, but just to show you in a little different format, we've been appropriating, you have been appropriating dollars in the rainy day fund each year. We did spend a little bit of those dollars this year, but then it goes to $817,000 on those out years. So this has been something you're used to. This is not new. We continue to appropriate dollars if something comes up unexpected. Now, on a combined basis, if you go to page 10, this is just a different way. Oh, excuse me, I skipped a page. Yeah, page 10, referendum fund. So I bolded off the page in this case to show you our nice increase in our property tax levy. The referendum fund does not take circuit breaker loss. It's above the circuit breakers. So there is no loss in this fund, so we get the benefit of the 12.96% increase in that levy. Scroll down just a little bit, please. Now, that budget still shows out of balance, but we had moved more expense into this fund on purpose to try and rebalance some of that cash back into education. But now it's not out of balance as much as we thought it was going to be out of balance when we first put the budget together because the AV came in higher. So, but this is a good thing. But if you spent all the budget just as is, you would still have over $5 million, $5.5 million at the end of 24, and your budgeted levy the next year is 8.3. So if you had about 4.2 million in cash, that's a good, strong cash balance for cash flow purposes. So again, here you could see at the bottom where transfers have been made out. and you didn't have any budget in there for 3 years, you were just making those transfers out, and you were budgeting it prior to that, you didn't, and now we're back to budgeting dollars essentially for some salaries and benefits, and then some of the operational costs. Now, the next page is just kind of looking at things by taking all the previous pages and just kind of combining them back. What's our overall cash position? What's it look like? And so you can kind of see, if you scroll down just a little bit to see the end of 22, our cash balance went from $13,169,000 to $13,638,000. It goes up again in 23, or at least I'm anticipating that to happen. And then again in 24. So when you look at it as a whole, now debt service dollars are restricted on how you can use those, but this is just another way of you kind of looking at that when you fold all the different funds back together. What's our cash position? And this gives you a good idea. It includes referendum, debt service, education, operations, rainy day. It includes all those. And then lastly, the tax rates, page 12. Because of the growth in AV and the formula the state is going to use, I'm anticipating they're going to drop that rate to about 49 cents this year. And then I've assumed that you would go back the year after. You could see that the operations fund rate is going from 0.348 to 0.3348. And that's a function of your levy only being able to go up 4%. Your operations fund levy went up 4%, but your assessed valuation went up 8%. So you don't have any control over that rate dropping. So, but you do have some control with the debt going forward to be able to bring that back up to that rate. So, you know, if you go back all the way to 2018, in 2018, your rate was $1.2699. At the end of 23, it's $1.2555. So your tax rate over time has remained pretty well flat. But we're going to see a decrease this year, mostly because the AV jumped so much in 1 year. So the AVs across the state, I would say yours did better. Yours didn't do quite as well last year as compared to other counties, but this year's yours did better than some of the other counties. So it seems like your increases may have been brought in a little over more of a 2-year period, the valuations. So there's really not a great incentive to lower the tax rate, to be honest, because you don't really get the full benefit of the decrease in the circuit breaker. Circuit breaker is calculated based on the total tax rate, including the city, the county, the township, and so library. So they look at that, and that circuit breaker is lost between that. But if you lower the rate and you have less circuit breaker loss, you don't get the full benefit of that. The other units get benefit from you lowering your rate. So it's not a $1-for-$1. So I would say the majority of the units I work with anymore try to manage to a tax rate. And so, so it all gets back to if we decide to issue bonds in 24 for 25, payable 25, we're going to lose that transfer ability, but we'll get access to do some new debt dollars. So that's a lot. So there were some legislative changes that weren't favorable to you this year, but overall you're in a good financial position.
Thank you very much, Mike. I really appreciate that. It's a lot of information. You explain it well. So we're going to move on to item 6, a Q&A from the Board of Trustees for either Mr. Reuter or Mrs. Kronk related to budget questions. If you would please make sure and indicate your questions with a raise of hand so that your microphone can be turned on. and before you start speaking. That's fine. It is a lot.
Mike and I are pretty sharp. We like it.
Mrs. Mumford.
Say at one time the circuit breaker was set to legislatively expire at some point. You're hot.
No, I don't.
I can hear him.
It's the recording issue.
Test there.
There we go. Dr. Yin is going to have to watch this via live stream, and so we need to get as clean a recording as we can. That's why we're being so cautious with microphones.
No, the circuit breaker will not expire. And it used to be in code only and could have been changed, but it was a constitutional amendment. It was put on a ballot, and unlikely that it would ever be voted on again to come out.
Okay, so it's a permanent cost we're gonna have to deal with.
Here's the thing. So it's 1% for residential homeowners.
Yeah,
It's 2% essentially for farm ground and residential rental, and it's 3% for commercial. At the beginning of the session, the Constitution says it can't be more than those percentages, but it can be less. They started off lowering the circuit breaker. They were trying to say it could be something less than 1%. We can lower that if we want. And so that was early on conversations coming out of the House. And so it can't be more than that because of the Constitution, but if property tax got out of hand, they could lower those circuit breakers again.
Mrs. Mumford, I believe, had a question.
Yes.
Yes, from the fiscal plan on page 1. I had a question on the summer schools. So you look at this, like last year we spent 9,000. This year we spent 150,000, and then we don't have any anticipation in the future.
So
What is the story with summer school?
Yeah, so that was just budgeted. I just saw that real expense come in today. What we actually spent, so it was budgeted high.
Okay,
And I can, let me pull that up. I gotta get my iPad out here. I just looked at that in the monthly report, and those amounts posted today. If you want to go on to another question, I'll look that up
Right.
while we're.
well, and part of that is why are we not budgeting for the future? Why is there zero summer school budget for 2024?
It's been so minor, I'm guessing that you may or may not have it. It's something you can choose. You're not funded at 100% of that.
Okay,
So let me tell you what I actually I saw come through in August.
and what is this paying? This is paying for the summer school instruction that's done in our building besides the fees that go to the virtual? Is it just our building?
It's just your programs that you have. You must have had some small programs. I can't speak to the
What
programs.
ran through this year was what we did at the high school and then the Indiana Online Academy, and then Jumpstart went through ESSER.
Okay,
So that's why it was so low.
Well, he's
in
looking at the
22.
actual expenditures. And,
Oh, I'm
yeah,
sorry. Okay, I thought it was.
and that's one thing I didn't bring with me. So yeah.
no, that's fine.
Yeah, so let's see.
So I guess that's a question I have for administration. So having nothing in the budget, are we saying we're not doing summer school next year?
Jumpstart is questionable because Jumpstart was 2 years based on ESSER, and that's why that was built in, and it was to close.
Yes. What
Learning gaps.
about like the social studies and all those other ones?
And those were done as, excuse me, not used to that being right there. Those were done as pilots, and so those are still discussions that we're having. The great thing about the changes they did at the state level with budgeting is you can move your money around to wherever you need it. So we budgeted in places, but it can be moved to other lines if we need to. So if we have summer school, we can move appropriation to that area.
Okay, so this budget actually isn't telling us anything about what our intents are for summer school.
We haven't had those discussions yet.
Correct.
Okay.
If you're asking if it's a no, if the budget's saying it's no, it's not saying
It's
it's
not,
no.
there's been no
Yeah.
decision.
Yes.
And we can pull the money from somewhere else.
Yes.
Yes.
Once the decision is made.
Yeah, we advertise high in the budget to allow for some flexibility and movement of those.
Okay.
So I have the real numbers here for elementary. It was budgeted at 80,000 and $2,130 was posted through August. And then $70,000 was budgeted at summer school, high school, and 54,158. And you will get some of those dollars back. It depends on how many people participate in summer school across the state. The state appropriates a fixed amount for summer school. And after everybody submits their reports of what they spent on summer school, then you get reimbursed a portion of that. And again, it just depends on how many people.
Do we get reimbursed for the elementary jumpstart summer school or just the high
That's
school?
an ESSER, so no, you cannot ask for
That's what I
reimbursement.
thought.
for that.
Okay. Just the high
Regular
school.
regular
Okay.
summer school.
That's what I thought. Thanks.
And that report has been filed, but we will not know until they compile the whole state data with what our reimbursement will be.
Some choose not to participate because they're not getting full reimbursement. So that's what you never know is, it's been cyclical over the years. Sometimes it's been real high because people are like going, I can't afford to offer summer school because I'm not getting reimbursed enough. So more people opt not for summer school and then the percentage goes back up. People get more and then suddenly people jump back in again. And then it can be cyclical sometimes depending on what the schools are doing.
So this high school number is our in-person our summer school taught by our social studies teachers in addition to any of those other online fees. It's any summer school that one of our high school students took
Yes,
is part of that number.
yes. And I don't think the payment for the Indiana Online has actually been expended yet. It was
Okay.
included in my reimbursement though, because it was a bill. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Budget has a rate of, you're going to keep it at 53.5375, it looks like, right?
After 24.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. So you're talking about actually laying more debt on it. Did you know how much money you were talking about in terms of issuance? You can get back to me later on that.
Yeah, I would guess you're probably around net proceeds. I'm guessing you're probably somewhere between 2.1 and 2.2
Okay.
after cost of issuance, as well as the interest expense that you would incur.
Yeah. And that's based on today's rates, probably.
Yeah, right. So it depends when you actually issue the bonds. I mean,
Okay.
short-term rates unfortunately have gone up considerably, where we used to be able to issue them for less than 1%.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
The
I
good
have
old
heard some
days.
good news from people lately though that have issued some that they're not too bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And short-term debt too, when you're doing small GOs, you're not committing yourself to a large amount. You get to decide. Some districts literally issue a short-term GO for 1 year, every year,
Just to keep the rate up.
just to keep the rate up.
Yeah, so if we don't do that, they're going to peel our rate back.
They're going to keep peeling your rate back, yeah. As a matter of fact, they'd peel it back a whole lot because it's when we stop the transfer, if we were to stop that transfer, they would really peel it back because they'd see they'd see a bunch of extra cash in there. So, but if let's say we kept the same payment and your AV continues to grow, your rate's going to continue to go down.
So we're the beneficiaries of a really good market.
Yeah. Now we do have some of our debt is laddered in there,
Yeah,
so we
that's
need
true.
we needed to grow some.
Yeah.
But we've seen it grow so much in the last 3 years, we're creating capacity.
I'm with you.
The short-term debit instead.
Yeah, when I say short term,
Less than 5 years?
Well, yeah, less than 5 year. You might decide that you want to package more than that. You might have some other needs you want to package in there. And so it would depend on the size. And if you want to manage the tax rate to that 0.53, then we would structure, the more you borrow, the farther out it goes, right? So.
Regarding that circuit break, I remember in the early this year, the legislation C sessions, they talk about going down from 95.95 and then
Right.
0.975 next year and then back to 1. So they didn't go through
They
that.
didn't do
Okay,
that.
They have their proposal. They have to think about that, but
They did in the House version. They had that in there.
but
It got taken out.
eventually they
But as it went through the process, that eventually got taken out. As I said, it seemed like the House was pretty aggressive on trying to
reduce tax,
reduce property taxes.
property tax.
And when it got over to the Senate, that got watered down, and then ultimately, what you heard tonight is what they ended up on. So
But they lowered the income tax, right? They didn't-
their income tax.
Yeah, that's what I think they
Yeah.
lowered that.
And that's important to note, is they lowered their income tax rate and scheduled to decrease, it'll decrease 1/10% this year and another 0.5%
Yeah, salary.
for the
That's what-
next
yeah.
3 years after that. So it's going down 1/4% over the next several years, starting in January. The reason that's important to you, you rely on state dollars. And so your 50%, your education fund is 50% of the state budget. And so any money they're giving up is ultimately less money that can come back out to K-12.
Yeah, the argument for them is you lower tax, but you were collecting, because encourage business and collecting more money.
Yeah.
But from your point of view, do you think that will be realized or?
Yeah, right. Good question. It all depends on the incomes. And,
Okay.
let's go to, if you go to page, I'll show you.
44 or something?
Actually, no, we're gonna go to page 14, I think. Go to page 14. This shows you the historical non-farm income of Indiana. And so 22 is an actual number here. So in 22, income in the state of Indiana went up 2.1%.
Okay.
The year before, it went up 8.3%. And so I would caution you on that, though. That was the year there was a lot of federal money pushed out, and that became income. And so, so wages really didn't increase a whole lot in 22. You would have thought it would have been higher than that, but because the base of 21 got set so high, he didn't realize there's so much growth when some of that one-time money went through. So you could see historically, though, you go all the way back to 16, there was only growing 2.7%. The logic behind this is years ago now. The logic behind this is they wanted to tie property tax increases to income. They did not want property tax to outpace income. And so they make the calculation of your operations fund levy off of income. In my opinion, 6 years is too long because it's slow to react one way or the other. It's slow to go down, it's slow to come up. And so things are happening in the economy, and you may be going up when the economy's going down. And so that's just my opinion, okay? That's not my decision, that's just my opinion, that 6 years isn't reacting quick enough with what the economy might be doing.
That's right, there's some delays.
And so in this case, then they just said, hey, we're going to calculate that, but we don't care what it calculates, you're going to be limited to 4%.
Another question regarding the property values. My understanding is if you property value is below 700,000, that will be 25%, right? And
Yeah,
but
it's
now
600.
they increased that to 40%.
No, there's still a threshold for values. I think it's 600,000.
600?
Yeah, so
Okay.
it's right now, it's,
If you below
I'd have to look
600 or
for sure.
25.
Yeah,
25%.
anything 600,000 or less gets 35%. Anything over 600,000 gets 25%. But next year, it will be anybody below 600 gets 40%, and I think anybody over 600 gets 25%. I don't know if they moved that 600 number. I have to go look at that.
Yeah. I remember is opposite, that below 1600 or 1700, it will be 35. After that will be,
Yes.
no, below 1700, it will be 25, no, 35.
Yeah,
so-
it's 35
35
right now.
below, okay, and after that, there will be 25.
25, yeah.
Okay, but now they increase that to
40%.
40%.
But then we'll go down to 37 and a half, and then we'll go down to 35 again.
Oh, so they kind of just temporarily, there was
Yes.
some side that,
Yes.
okay, gotcha.
There's temporary relief built in
Okay, that's.
for that
okay.
supplement. Again, though, some people may not benefit from that if they're well over the circuit breaker. That deduction won't help them. It just
right.
depends on where you're at in the circuit breaker.
State.
The answer's out there. I just don't know off the top of my head. I know IASBO tracks
I think
that.
Dr. DeBoer
Oh,
had
Larry.
it in his
Yeah, I think-
presentation.
I think Dr. DeBoer did have that in his material. I'd have to look that back up again.
For the third.
Probably, yeah. There are
All they
more-
did was shift everything over to local decisions.
And that's the answer they give you too. If you say that you're having issues with finances, they tell you to just run a referendum.
So could I ask you to ask for a little remediation on something, a little remedial instruction?
Okay.
In the past, you have talked to us about the impact that transfer tuition has on our budget and have kind of explained how optimizing our ADM is ideal for us financially. Could you address that again for us tonight?
Yeah, so there's two types of transfer students that you have, okay? So you have the Tippecanoe transfers that when you bill them, you're billing them for what your costs were, what your actual costs were, plus the referendum. And then you have transfer students that are included in your ADM that wouldn't be necessarily Tippecanoe schools. And so that just runs through the formula. And you get the dollars from the state on that. The state kind of looks like, whether in that district or your district, we're going to give you the money for those kids.
But to clarify on that, to make sure you understand, we're giving you accurate information to our office too. Those students that we're collecting ADM on are students that are staff students because you're required by law to take those students, and we would, but we are a closed district to transfer students as far as that you collect ADM on. So I just want to make sure the board understands that too.
Just
Thank you for
staff,
clarifying.
staff only
Yes.
and transfer from our TSC agreement only,
Yes.
right?
And so like this year, you lost 60 some kids in that count from the state. So the state's going to be paying less for those 63 kids, but you're making up 19 of them by charging cash transfer to Tippecanoe schools. So you didn't make up all of it, but you made up 19 of the 63 lost.
Except the problem is the money that we get from the state and even the referendum isn't the only money that we spend on students. So when you take what our annual revenue is and divide it by the number of students we have today, that's going to give us about 15,000, 16,000 that we spend per student. When we charge TSC, they're only paying 9 to 10,000. So we actually are not like, it's not making us even equal bringing them in.
Yeah, you
Bringing
never-
them in is costing us.
You've never been able, the state has never allowed you to charge for debt
Right,
because they consider those assets of the community.
exactly.
And so, so they've never allowed us to choose for debt. But I would say where the transfer students help you is optimizing the operations of each building. And ultimately, it's the classroom, right? Your most protected resource is your classroom dollars. And so if your class sizes get small, that may feel good. But if you aren't optimizing your class sizes, it's costing you more. And I think I may have shared this example when I was at Hamilton Southeastern. We had a small school called Durbin Elementary, and it might have had 300 kids or so in it. And we had larger elementaries. As we built new schools for new kids, they were built 625 students. But we had a principal and assistant principal in that building, 600, and we had a principal and assistant principal in this building, and you have an art, music, PE librarian in both models. And so it is so much more expensive to operate a smaller building than it is a larger building to a point. If you get to a point where you got to start adding resources back for art, music, PE, librarian, principal, then that's your tipping point, right? But actually, I've always said this, actually, the more kids you have, the easier it is to manage class size. The smaller the numbers, it was always hard at Durbin because it was either a really small class or a really big class. And so the bigger buildings were much easier to balance those. And you were getting, because the dollars you're getting from the state, you know, it is a dollar, it's not based on the seats, it's based on the pupils you report. And so that's where you optimize your space. You know, you wouldn't want your buildings to go half capacity. That'd be a serious financial problem, right? So knowing what's the right point.
Well, I think I mean, we have several problems with just saying we accept all TSC transfer students. Number one, our enrollment numbers are down this year for ADM in-district students. Because when you look at several families I actually know, they were going to move to West Lafayette School District, but were told, we accept transfer students from TSC. So they said, I'm going to move across the street and get a bigger house because I'm promised to come here. So now we have, I mean, it's more valuable if they live in our district because they're paying debt service and property taxes. But we're finding that those are not living in our school districts, but allowed to transfer in. So that's one issue that we have with just saying, you know, we're hurting our students that live here by just saying anyone out of district come in. You won't bring all the money to cover all the fees that we that live in it pay it. So to me, that's one big issue with going the route that we have been going. Another issue is that, sorry, my mind's jumping and now I have to remember
Can
what
I
my
address
next.
what you just said?
Yes, please.
Because I also have friends who are transfer students in, and what they were told when they initially enrolled was they had 2 children. And it was, we have room in the 4th grade, but we're not sure if we have room in the 2nd grade for your child. So they waited until, I think, the week school started. It might have been the night before, I can find out. But they waited, and the principals were involved in counting the kids and seeing where the class size was. And at the last minute, they were able to come in. But it was a question up until the last minute whether or not it would be appropriate to bring one additional 2nd grader in.
So was this
So
this year?
this was during COVID. It would have been 22. So yeah, they've been here a year, and now this is their 2nd year here. So what I'm saying is that the idea that we accept all transfer students willy-nilly and we just open the door to a floodgate of children is incorrect and misleading. And what is correct is that it's done very deliberately and carefully, counting those little noses all the way down to a single 2nd grader to make sure that they can serve all the children in the class, regardless of where they live, appropriately.
So I think that's a question. Did we turn away any TSC students this year?
We turned approximately 4 students away.
Because
We
of
did not
class
turn them,
size?
we did not turn them away for class sizes, because what we would do is add a teacher.
So 4 students were because of your behavioral
Yes.
or attendance. So not because of class sizes.
That's correct.
Because that's the other concern that I see is, for example, 5th grade, we are at the highest class sizes we've ever had in West Lafayette. And we have classes that you're watching every week and saying, are we going to hit over the max this school year? Yet we have said, if you have a 5th grader, come in. And so we aren't taking advantage of saying our low class sizes, we want to fill those seats. We're just saying, come in. And when we hit 5th grade now, we have teachers that are having 25 kids in their class, which in my view is just, this is not why we moved to West Lafayette, and class sizes are important. And so that's what I don't understand, why it's just an open. I agree with you that if we had grade levels that were low and we were trying to balance it out, but right now we're just saying, come in. So right now our 5th grade is ginormous. Now, I don't know, we don't have any policy. I think we should set a policy, but when a transfer student is accepted, I don't think we should ever kick them out unless it's attendance or behavior. I think, you know, that's not wise on the educate. If we're going to bring a transfer kid, we should commit to educate them. Now, unfortunately, that's not been the case. Families are fearful, and I don't agree with that. But so at this point, we've set 5th grade, you are stuck with super high numbers for the next 7 years. And it's like, wait a second, that doesn't benefit us. we even have to hire another teacher to do these transfer students. That definitely does not help us. That's costing us. But we have these grade levels that are super low. Heck yeah, let's say bring in some transfer students. So that's why I'm struggling with this blanket. If you live in TSC, you get to come here. Does that make
Okay,
sense?
number one. I haven't seen it anywhere said, all you fifth graders, come on over here. That, I don't know where you're finding that message, but I've never seen that, and I've lived here for 25 years. Number two, if you have a building with a principal and a nurse and a lawn that needs to be mowed and lights that need to be on, it doesn't cost any more for these lights to be on if this room is full or if this room is this full. It's the same bill. So when you say it's costing us, it's not entirely true, because all of those, they're indirect costs in my world, but I don't know if that's the same terminology. Those indirect costs, all of those still have to be paid. And some of that money that's coming in with that kid can go to those payments. So it's not costing us. The building has to be on and functioning with a certain crew, whether we have 25 kids or 20 kids. Now, I don't know anything about the fifth grade. Go
I would
ahead.
like to say too, that if the board decides that 24, 25, or 26 students in fifth and sixth grade is too many, that needs to be decided, because I've never heard that. I've been here 2 years, and 24, 25, and 26 students, in my experience, when I was at Hamilton Southeastern, in Fayette County, and in South Montgomery schools, was an appropriate number. If this board feels differently, as Mrs. Mumford just said, we just need to understand that, because we can and could add a teacher. We want to maximize dollars. I believe 24, 25, and 26 students is actually an acceptable number for fifth and sixth grade. But if the board feels differently and we need directed differently as a board collectively, we just need to hear that. That does impact, though. It does impact wages and salaries. And we also talk about the importance of a competitive school system so that we can attract the best teachers for our district. And we are working hard to do that. And I just want to make sure that everybody here understands it's a balance, but we just need to understand where the board is 24, 25, 26. That helps us know where we're at during bargaining, during budgeting. So we just need to understand that. I want to make sure you guys understand that. We can manage class sizes. We just need to understand what the rule is of this board. If the board thinks 24 students, 25 students in fifth grade is too many, and sixth grade is too many, I need to understand that.
And I want to,
We don't even have to close the district. I'm telling you, we can add another teacher, is what I'm saying, and still maximize our buildings when you look at principals and costs and so forth.
well, and I want to add that it would be questionable for a board who are not education professionals to tell the educational professionals that we've hired to do the job what the class size number should be. We ask them to perform, we ask them to set those limits. Class sizes were not even a priority set when we met as a board and talked about priorities. Didn't even make it on the paper, if I recall. What we asked them to do is to perform a job and to manage a school corporation and to understand what class sizes are appropriate and make recommendations to us about what that might be. I can tell you, I mean, I'm a parent to many children. I don't have a strong feeling about 23 in the fifth grade versus 25 in the fifth grade versus 27 or 30. There are school corporations around the state, however, I will say, that would fall all over themselves for our class size numbers. And my view, and I would like to say it publicly, is that I believe our school leadership have done an exceptional job at managing class sizes. So I don't agree with your statement that 25 is unconscionable, and I think that needs to also be stated in a public meeting. 25 is a luxury number for a good percentage of our state.
Can we put it on the agenda to discuss and vote on class sizes so that the community can hear where the board stands on how to handle class sizes? Because if I understand correctly, one view is this superintendent and administration do what they want. That is not the only view. Another view is that the board can give direction and share from input from teachers, because I know teachers are not happy with class sizes, input from the community, and share recommendations for class sizes. So I think it sounds like an agenda item as a board that can be discussed.
Mrs. Mumford, I would just like to make it clear that you do not speak on behalf of all teachers. And the way you just stated your words said that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's how I received it anyway. So I want to let you know that that's what I heard.
I apologize.
I also would just say to you that it is not what I just said, I believe might have been misinterpreted. I did not say we just let our leadership do whatever they want. What I said is that we believe in the leadership who we hire and review to make best decisions for students.
I would like to add too that we do discuss with teachers, and we're going to actually discuss on Thursday. One of the topics is class size. And what I mean by that is we are going to look at where the class sizes are. And we've talked about the 24 and 25 and if we got to a certain point. So I just want to make sure that you know that during discussion, we do talk about that. And we talk about it at the end of the year, and we monitor it. We talk about it even then into the beginning of the year. And so we talked about it that first month, and we're going to talk about it again. So I want to make sure that you and all the boards are aware of that we do discuss that.
But to answer your question, if you would like to put something on the agenda, you may do that. I would ask you to consider if that would best serve on the October or November or December agenda. Because class sizes for the year are the class sizes for this year, and timeliness matters in that conversation.
I would like to touch on one other thing too. You mentioned people moving out. So it kind of depends. If they're going out and building a new house, and we're losing that assessed valuation. But the house they're leaving is still here.
Oh, sorry, not moving out. People that are moving to West Lafayette. So every summer we get an influx of families into West Lafayette, and they have to decide, are we going to buy a house? So they're new, are they going to buy a house here or out there?
Right.
And they're choosing to not buy houses here at the same rate as they were, and they're buying it across the street because they can't.
Well, let's say we had someone move out. Let's say we say, well, I want to go live somewhere else, but I still want to go to school here. Well, that house is still here paying the debt service rate. So, it's a question of, can you fit more houses into this area? And that's the problem, right? So right now, if someone moves out and just goes to Tippecanoe, the house is still here paying the debt service rate. They may not be paying it. They may not be paying it. They're paying Tippecanoe debt rate, but that house is still paying for the debt. If it doesn't have a kid in it, they're still paying the debt rate. So everybody's still paying that debt rate. Even the only way it goes down is if the house is torn down, which is
Not likely to happen.
not likely to happen. So
Okay, so am I understanding correctly, though, if you were asked how much we spend per student, it would be about 16,000. And we do not bring that in. And so the more transfer students that we bring in, the less money that we have to spend per student. Is that correct?
no, because debt, the operations fund is set at 4% no matter what.
Right.
So it's just set at 4%, unless those kids are going to drive up your operating costs, which probably is your utilities and all those costs that you pay on operations fund are your operations, right? They're not changing with students. Education fund different, you have educational classroom costs there. But the debt rate is still collecting the debt rate,
Right.
whether those kids move in or not.
Okay.
And so they're paying a debt rate for Tippecanoe, but all the houses here, if there are no longer kids, then we're still paying the debt rate.
Okay.
So we're not getting it from them, per se, from that parent, but we're still getting it from the taxpayers of the taxpayers
Okay.
of West Lafayette.
Okay, so it doesn't, there's going to be things like your ELL teacher, your paraprofessionals, all of them, they are now having to service more students. So there are services there's less interventions that my child may get, will get, as each student, additional student is brought in. Is that correct to understand?
No,
Well, it depends on the needs of the student, I guess.
it's the law that we service the needs of the students we have. If we have students who are English language learners or who are having IEPs, we're going to service them the same regardless of whether or not we have transfer students. Those two things aren't at all related.
So an ELL class, you could have a certain, your numbers can increase. That just means there's more that the teacher is working with, is what I'm explaining. I'm not saying we've denied them services.
Okay.
So, and then if I understand correctly with TSC, this, and maybe you don't know this, I don't know, is we don't have actually a memorandum of understanding with them of this transfer. It's all just an agreement between the two superintendents? Okay. Can we postpone this till next, whenever our work session is, so that we can involve Dr. Greiner? I think it's.
Well, you've already posed this question to him in a meeting with him, and I believe he answered you, if I understand correctly.
Right, but I want it on the public record is what I'm trying, like, these are questions, so I like to, out of respect, often ask questions ahead of time so the information can be collected. But anytime that I think the community would like to hear about it, then I ask those questions in public. So like this one is something that I think is interesting. The community would like to hear about this. So my question is, I have some additional questions on the budget, on our capital projects. I mean, there's a lot of things here, but I struggle that we don't even have our superintendent here to ask the questions. So I guess my question is, can we follow up with a work session?
So I don't recall receiving those questions from you, Mrs. Mumford. Did I receive them and miss them?
No, I was told not to meet with Dr. Greiner or ask questions, so I.
But what we asked you to do was submit questions to the board chair so that those could be shared with everyone on the board in a transparent way. And I don't recall receiving any questions from you. Did you send those
I
questions to me?
didn't. I don't need to ask questions ahead of time. I can just ask in the work session. I didn't know Brad asked ahead of time. Did you ask any questions ahead of time through an email, Brad? So
No,
what-
the
why
issue
that
is that the difficulty we have is that we made everybody in the board aware that Dr. Reiner needed to leave,
Fair.
right? And he's doing that in service to our school corporation to present,
Agreed.
to help our community understand our school finances and our school strengths and weaknesses. So that state of the school's address is an important thing for him to do. So we knew that in advance that he was going to be leaving and what time he was going to be leaving this evening. So if you had a list of questions, it would have been helpful for you to have shared those with me, and that means that they're shared with the whole board. I do know that you asked Dr. Reiner many of these questions in a private meeting you called for with him, and that was not available to the rest of the board to see.
He
And
shared
so-
with you afterwards, so. I asked him to share everything that
Yeah.
I asked him a question on to share, so it was nothing about a secretive. That's incorrect.
Okay. Here's my question to you, though. If I just want to make sure that I understand of the questions that were submitted to Dr. Reiner that you had for him about these issues that were then shared with everybody on the board, and the questions, and I believe it was almost 40 questions in total that were asked that particular week. Are any of the questions you intend to ask him tonight not questions that you previously have asked him?
So I have questions on the budget that we are currently discussing with the presentation that was given. And I would like to ask those questions in a work session in a public meeting.
Okay.
The time has come to an end, which is understandable. We knew this. So my question is, can we have a future work session before we're asked to adopt the budget so that these questions can be asked?
Okay, so here is my question for you. Are any of these questions that you have that you would like to ask tonight, are any of them new questions that have not previously been asked by
Yes.
you? Okay, so it would be helpful if you would provide those questions to me so the whole board is able to see those questions. If you are open to doing so, you will get the best answers from Dr.
So-
Reiner on those.
I would like to ask my questions in a public meeting. I am not trying to have a conversation. There has been so many emails between you, Amy, and some of the board members, and I don't agree with that. I want the conversation in a public meeting. And I have tried to ask questions, like I had a simple question today about an enrollment number. And so, I mean, I try to be respectful that if it's not a public question that I can ask that, and I've been very open to that. But my question right now is, I have questions on the budget that I would like to ask in a work session and not through email.
So, so you are aware, since we are having things be on public record right now, when you joined the board, our method for making sure that all board members had transparent access to questions and answers that they had was twofold. It was done in a weekly board chair note, and it was also offered through a board mentorship for new members. At your and another member's request, we are no longer doing the board chair notes to disseminate information to the board. And we also had both of our new members decline board mentorship for training. So it's left us with very few options in terms of making sure that all board members have access to the same information. Some of the board members have then chosen to try and conduct private meetings with different leaders of our schools. It takes a lot of time. 1 week alone before our last meeting, Dr. Greiner had a 2-hour meeting with you. Then he had 37 questions that he and his staff had to answer. And then he had a follow-up request from another board member for a private meeting. The difficulty with that method of communication among a board is that the board members who are not sitting next to you in those private meetings that you're holding don't know what's happening in them. So because of that large burden placed upon our school leadership, I, as board chair, consulted with the other officers and said, we have to come up with some variety of system where all board members can be transparently aware of what's happening. That is when the direction went out for me to everyone on the board. If you've got a question, please send it to me. I will answer it. And if I cannot answer it or a board officer cannot answer it, we will ask our superintendents to support the answer on that. We need to let him do his job. Right? It's his job. It's what we've hired him to do. It's why we've hired Mike Reuter to be a financial consultant. It's why Mrs. Kronk works for us in our business office. This kind of gamesmanship stuff that's going on is not indicative of the board working together. And that is what I'm asking you again today to do. So I hear your question asking for a follow-up work session regarding this before we review a budget. It is possible that we could schedule that for October. At this point, you've asked for a work session every month, and no other single board member has wanted one other than you. So if we don't have a body of our board who want to have a work session, then I don't know what to tell you. But what we really need to be doing, I would be hopeful, would be being on the same team as our school board, or as our school leadership. And that means asking questions in advance. That means hoping for the best answers. That means including everyone on the board. And that means doing it, assuming the best of the other people answering the questions, both in competency and intent. So I'm happy to consider the request for a work session. That would be if we hold it 7 a.m. before our next meeting, the Friday before our next meeting. Are there any other questions that you'd be willing to discuss while we have Mr. Reuter and Mrs. Kronk here, because he is the one prepared the financial plan for us?
There are a few on that you may know from the budget that I'm happy to ask you, if that's okay.
Yeah, so if it's budget specific
Yes.
line items, I wouldn't.
You won't know that?
No, I would be
Oh.
happy to try and answer them. I'm
Okay.
not sure if I'll know the answer off the top of my head because there's so many numbers that go.
No, exactly. When I looked at some of these numbers, it's like, wow. I mean,
Yeah,
anyways,
so-
wanting to
So
understand.
just so you know too, this document is a model, is
Yes.
to help you kind of plan and see things in the history, see current where we're going. It's not a required document. I mean, this is something that is supplemental to the budget process. The Form 3, believe it or not, is the only form that is technically required for the meeting for a public hearing. So, but I'm happy to try and answer any
That'd be
questions
great.
about the fiscal plan.
So starting on page 2, it says foundation donations. Do we know if we have received any money from the foundation
have
for
not.
construction?
Yeah, there was a commitment.
Yes.
Let me look at my old notes here, okay? I can get my other previous notes out.
Since I have been here, no, we have not.
Okay, and we don't know, I mean, I know that there was money raised. I was here during that time.
We're
period.
currently
They were
having discussions
raising
with them about that.
money, but we haven't been ever given any of that money.
Not that I am aware of.
Okay,
There was a commitment from the foundation up to $1.6 million.
sorry,
Page
page
two.
2, with that. So, and that you're aware of, we haven't received any.
Yeah, we have not.
And you don't know why? Do you know
Well,
why we wouldn't, they wouldn't give us the money?
We've been using that 2017 money first.
Okay,
And so, so it took me a while to peel that back last year, but we also received rent money from the city.
right.
So that miscellaneous revenue number there was rent money coming from the city.
Yep, okay,
And then down at the bottom, you see that 300,000 bolted off. That was
Yeah.
2017 bond proceeds. When I built the fiscal plan the first time, I knew about the commitment from the foundation,
yes,
but it was limited to the 2019 and 2020 bonds.
okay,
And so I built the line item in there, but I have not had to use any revenue from that 1.6 million to fund any
from the
short.
foundation.
Yeah, from the foundation.
Okay.
It is not, we've not had to use it on those debt payments yet.
Okay, well, because we're also sitting like on, I think when I looked it up, 2.7 million for the bond payment for 2017. So your view is we're using that one up and then you would
Yeah.
go to the foundation?
So at one point, and this has been dated back to last year, we had 3.5, but we've used some of it.
Right,
And that's where you see some of that money in what I anticipate to be used yet for the next 2 years
Right,
of that 2017 money. But that's where I was also mentioning that that money is earmarked for bond payments, that 2017 money. And you technically could do another bond and use that money on bond payment.
borrow money to,
So in other words, we had 3.5,
Right.
we used some of it to backfill to cover our payments.
exactly,
But anything that's left is still earmarked for bond payments. But technically, you could do another bond and use that money on that,
right.
pay it off in your short-term bond.
With the purpose, if I understood what you were explaining correctly, to get our tax rate back up, we would borrow money, we'd use borrowed money to pay borrowed money.
No, not to keep the 2017 money separate. That is an additional step if you wanted to.
Okay,
That's not, you'd be borrowing money to keep the tax rate up, but that's not using this.
that's just saying if we want to also use this, I mean, then we
Yes.
can use this to pay that off. But,
You could.
I mean,
yes.
not pay it off, but pay towards it. But the reason we're wanting to take another one, consider it, is to get that tax rate back up.
Keep it at the 0.5375. And that doesn't have anything to do with the 17 bonds. That's just if you want to access those 17 bonds, you could by issuing a bigger bond issue and using those 17 bonds on the payment.
Offset that.
But that's in addition to,
That makes
if
sense.
that makes sense. So what I'm suggesting is a short-term general obligation bond, probably going to need proceeds around, a little better than $2 million. But if you went more than $2 million, you could fold in the 17 bonds.
And if we went more, would that affect the debt rate?
No, because you'd be taking, what you do is you set the short-term payment up for whatever's in that 17 bond. Essentially, you take the 17 bond and make that payment. And
Okay,
that would become proceeds, bond proceeds that you could use.
okay,
That makes sense? You're basically
Yes.
turning those restricted bond payments into proceeds
okay.
if you had projects you wanted to do.
Okay, so then on page 7. Oh, yes, please.
Money we still have in that bank?
Michelle and I were just talking, we don't have the exact number. I know it was $3.5 million last year, and we've used some of those dollars. So I don't have tonight with me. Those are holding corporation dollars and not sitting on your books. So
I think it's about 2.7 million, but
left right now.
is what it seems like, but I don't know. Is that,
But that amount of money is not in the school's book, it's outside.
Yeah, it's not in any of these accounts that you're seeing here. It's sitting in a proceeds.
It's a separate fund on the fund report.
Yeah, it's sitting in a proceeds account.
So that's 2.7, something around.
It's not in any of these documents that I have here.
Because those aren't technically budgeted funds.
Yeah.
They're separate on the fund report, so.
Okay, on page 7. No, if you have more, I mean, I don't do what. Okay, the line item for miscellaneous revenues. In 2023, we jumped for overpayments and reimbursements to 189,000, where just last year was.
I can actually explain that. So I'm the one that actually built the budget. So
Okay.
as far as that for this year, we had not been reimbursing, getting reimbursed for the pool. And so pool proceeds were supposed to go towards reimbursing the school corporation.
Okay,
And we finally did that this year. So that's why that's so large. So that will not be that large going forward because we'll be doing it every 6 months.
so explain to me where the money that the pool brought in.
Yes.
Was going where?
It's supposed to be somewhat of a self-sustaining program,
Right.
bringing in funds with the programs that they're doing to help them pay for the lifeguards that are covering the pool.
Yes, okay.
And so we ran expenditures for the past couple of years for that and looked at the amount of money they had in their ECA account for the money they were taking in for the pool program and to determine an amount to pay back some of those expenses.
I see. So they take all the money they get and put it in their ECA
It goes into an
account.
ECA fund, yes.
And then they use that to pay it, whatever we cover for lifeguards and
Yes.
other expenses.
Yeah.
And we
So
just
every
hadn't
6
done
months.
that previous to you
Right.
being here.
Right.
And so,
Yeah, so about every 6 months, we plan on taking a look at what those numbers look like. And then the ECA treasurer, I would work with the ECA treasurer then to make that transfer.
well, that's phenomenal. Thank you for your work. I'm glad you're here.
So initially when that program was started, the leadership of that program was given a little bit of a breathing space for startup. So I don't want there to be the assumption there was any kind of negligence prior to Mrs. Cronk looking at it. It was an initial startup, a ramp up, and then she came in and did exactly what we would hope she would do. And
Well, the
evaluate.
CFO previously intentionally didn't do it.
It
I mean, 'cause
wasn't-
I don't think it was I'm
No.
not saying the pool people.
No, it was the initial piece was to allow them a little bit of space and resource to grow and develop. A combination of a pool opening and COVID and developing programming there and all those things that happen. There was definitely conversation at various board meetings in a public setting about how we needed to let them grow and develop. So there was no intent to shortchange our school corporation for pool revenue. There's no nest egg there. There was no privacy there. It was kind of, let's let you grow and develop great programming for our students.
Yeah, I actually had a discussion with Mr. Sloat about that.
Yeah.
And we kind of had a discussion about how the intention of that was and when it would kind of start. And so that's why I took a look at that this year.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, what about transportation? On that same page under expenditures, do you know why it's dropped so much?
Yeah, that was expense that was moved to the referendum fund.
because previously we
Oh,
were
yeah, page 11,
were
I'm supposed to-
transferring from
no.
referendum
Oh,
to
that one goes to
operations.
referendum.
Yes.
And now we're directly expending from the referendum fund instead of
There
the
you go.
operations fund.
So you see the transportation budget in referendum.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
Okay,
Doesn't
sorry.
mean the budget's not there, it's just in a different place.
No, I had that on that beginning page and found it on page 11, but that one I had forgotten. What about the land acquisition and development jumped from 14 to 135? What would that be?
And that's still a budget number, I believe, isn't it, Mr.
Are
Reuter?
you on page
Sorry, I'm still on page 7.
7? Sorry. And you're saying which?
The land, under expenditures in the middle, land acquisition and develop. So last year was 14,000 and this year is 135,000. Did we acquire new land
That
or?
was, no, that's not acquired. That's
Or,
if
I mean-
you, it was parked there if you needed land, if you bought.
It's taking
land.
care of land, basically.
Yeah,
Now, why is it costing us 100, I mean, why is it budgeted to cost us
I don't know that we
135
spent
versus
any of that
15?
this year.
We typically budget land acquisition for things like redoing parking lots, striping, things like that. And sometimes you never know if you're going to have to do those things, so you dump money into those. And like I said, the beauty of our budgets now is we can move those appropriations. The important thing is we get those appropriations into the fund, and then we can move them around if we need to, if something comes up and we need to move it somewhere else. Or it's there in land acquisition if we decide, or if we see that we have to redo a parking lot or reseal something.
So do you know why? I mean, I just would love to understand why we upped it $100,000.
I was not here
ever
for the
before.
23 budget,
Yeah, I
so,
can't
yeah.
speak
You don't know why?
specifically to
Okay.
that goes back a year. I'd have to dig.
And
If
then
I could
also,
take a swing at that one, I would guess it's because parking lots cost a heck of a lot of money. And if you're gonna have to resurface a parking lot, you're going to need a large amount budgeted, but if you end up not having to resurface that parking lot, you can roll that money somewhere else to be better used. Good guess?
I would normally dump about 300,000 in at Kokomo, and sometimes we used it, sometimes we didn't.
Right.
okay, so will that be similar to the few lines down where it says building acquisition, construction and improvements that
We
jumped?
put those appropriations in there in case we need them. Sometimes we will need them, sometimes we do not. Building acquisition, construction, those are for larger things that we may have to do to a building. For instance, I'm going to be bringing something to you next month that will probably use building acquisition money, and that's really for large repair things or renovations.
Is that this capital plan? Those
Part of
type
the capital
things?
plan.
Part of it?
And that's for 24, but yes, yeah.
Okay.
You're looking at the difference
Yeah, just
between the
looking.
budget and the actual, or the actual is 2022 and the budget's 2023. So
No, right.
when you make your home budget, you may budget $500 for groceries for the month and only spend $450, and then you get to go shopping.
Right,
It's
but I
the same
usually
thing.
look at my history and have a reason if I increase it a ton, which is why I was just
So
curious.
through August, none of the 135 has been spent.
Zero expenditure.
Through
They
August.
just budget, maybe they want to.
Yeah, it was budgeted, but not, it has not
Not
been spent.
used.
And I guess this was pre-use, so it'd only be school board members that would maybe remember why they chose to budget that.
Yeah, we were also in transition, to be real frank.
Yeah.
Between, it was Janelle and I.
I think the budget process was a little bit different last year than it was.
Yeah, it was,
Yeah.
well, and we were also, we were also going
And sorry,
through-
Kokomo's is still in my head, so.
Yeah, last summer, we were in transition of Steve leaving, and
Yeah.
Janelle and I were trying to put together a budget
Correct.
together that seemed reasonable to, at least in total, that seemed reasonable, that may not gotten spent when Michelle got in, may not gotten spent exactly how
That makes
all
sense.
those was appropriated.
And it's advertised high.
Yeah.
It's advertised to leave room. And so
Advertising and adopt time.
from my memory and my recall of that, you're going to do, if you're going to advertise high, you're going to try and be as safe as possible. And that might mean budgeting in certain areas where you maybe don't have a huge historical spend, but you want to make sure that if you do have a need, you know what that is. If you'll recall that time, we were also going through our assessment of all of our facilities and demographic study and all the other things attached to that to understand what exactly we were working with, so.
And that's why I made the comment earlier through, even though it's budgeted, we budget high, we should be trying to spend to our revenue.
Yeah.
No matter whether it's budgeted or not, we should always try to spend to our revenue.
I think there are some regulations, you cannot spend more than what you budget, is that right? My understanding
No,
there-
because you could spend more if you wanted to use cash balance.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I
say you
still
had cash
remember-
balance, you could spend,
Okay.
you could spend into cash balance.
I remember I saw somewhere they say you cannot.
And no
spend more.
deficit budgets.
Yeah, you can, that's why they have a budget a little bit overstate, so in case, you know,
Yeah.
you try to buy something and the price going up, so you still can handle that.
Yeah.
That's my understanding, but.
Okay, on page 8, do you happen to know Office of Business Manager? They listed 1.2 million.
It was just parked there because they didn't.
Like, why that, I mean, why that budget line item? I mean, how
That-
did things like that get decided?
Good question. I mean, I don't, all that's pre-me. I mean, you could see the expenses that were paid out
Yeah.
of there. It was all charged to that business services.
So who knows what?
Right below
Yeah,
that,
I
though,
mean-
the projected unused appropriation, which is almost,
And
Yeah,
this,
not
and
even-
the reason we spent some, it was part of pension. We paid some pension. It was just paid out of the business budget.
Yeah, I believe that previously they budgeted most of the retirement severance in the 25,000. I'm budgeting them in different program codes for whoever it actually is. So,
And we just, coming forward, we just budgeted like, had they been spending it, but the $1.2 million was never intended to be spent.
Okay. I
It
just
was,
wondered why
it was, you could see the difference in the unused
Yeah.
appropriation, that little bit, that was
No,
part
it
of a
wasn't.
pension.
Just more sitting there.
Yeah. And that's what I'm pretty sure what those expenses were in prior years. That's just what I was pulling out of the reports at that time.
So I think it was on your presentation, Mrs. Crock, that talked about severance payments of 97,000. What do we have coming up? I thought we had.
Well, we
paid it.
always have retirement severance payments because we have that language in our teacher contract, and we also have retirement severance for administrators as well, and for classified staff. So we have retirement severance for basically all staff if they qualify.
So is this, well, that's what I'm trying to understand. Dr. Killian, I thought when I looked at the accounts payable, there were certain line items that it was like, this is for Dr. Killian's and we're done with it. And now it's just a general. So 97 is just all that we pay in total for
That is just,
our teachers and
I put money in
administrations
there
all together?
because with discussions I had with Mike, we talked about appropriating a certain amount, and that's the
Okay.
amount that I put in there. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be spent, because I can't necessarily guess who's going to retire in 24 at this time. But I have money there for that purpose if we need to use it.
Okay.
And that's why budgeting is so hard. Like I mentioned, we're looking at revenue, looking at 2 different school years, so there's a lot of assumptions there. And we're trying to guess, when I'm making this budget, 7 months ahead as to what I'm going to be spending for the next 12 months after that. So it is a very difficult process. The easiest thing is actually doing projections for salaries and benefits. Everything else is a pure guess. But we like to have the appropriations there in case it happens. Like I said, if we have to do an additional appropriation because a $500,000 project comes up, that's a 2-month process to get an additional appropriation. So we appropriate for things in like rainy day or operations for things that might happen, but they may not happen in the end.
This would be an example too. Let's say you decide to do a bond. That 817,000 you have appropriated in rainy day, you could pass a resolution as a board saying, we want to do a bond reimbursement resolution, but we want to, before the bond's issued, we want to move forward with those expenses. So that $817,000 is there to be spent, but then it could get reimbursed from a bond.
Okay.
So let's say 800,000, let's say you have a project for 800,000, you've got it appropriated, no intent to spend it right now, but you could spend it and then include a bond reimbursement resolution. And when you issue the bond, then pay yourselves back.
Okay.
If you notice, like there's things, I put $650,000 in purchase services in the rainy day. That's possibly if, we have to repair a large piece of equipment or HVAC at a school building. Like if we have an emergency repair that we have to make. I have that money in rainy day if we've had a whole bunch of other things in the operations fund that I don't necessarily have the money for because, we're limited. We do things like that in the operations fund as well.
So the capital plan, if I understand correctly, if we want to do anything in the next 3 years, it has to be listed here.
No, you don't have,
If
you
we
can
want to,
amend
we
that
don't.
plan. Yeah,
Okay.
you can amend that plan. These are things that we might possibly need to do over the next 3 years or possible purchases. You can
Right.
amend that plan at any time if something else comes up or something changes.
It's a matter of making sure that our community and the board is well aware of what might be coming down the road. It's a means of communication.
Well, so my confusion is last year we did one with dates and many of them didn't. Like,
Right.
what was the intent of putting dates on them?
Because they ask us to.
Yeah.
So then why does some of them not have dates?
Because it's purely a guess.
What I mean is if it's required to have a date, why doesn't all of them have dates?
If you notice the one that I put to be determined, that's kind of a very large one that we're probably having much greater conversations about.
Yeah.
And so I really didn't feel comfortable putting a date there.
Okay.
And I
For
would
that very
guess
reason.
if there's not a dollar amount, you don't have to have a date, probably.
And that might be, that could be over a 5 or 6 year period. So
And just because it's in there, it doesn't mean you'll do it either.
Okay.
So it's not they changed the capital projects plan just a few years ago. It used to be a 3-year capital projects plan, and it was to show how much you're going to spend in different categories, and they completely changed it. We used to have a capital projects fund. There's a fund in here called capital projects. That's when it changed.
Okay.
And so then they went to this. But my experience with this is people kind of put everything into it, because if it's in there, they're covered, but if it's not in there, they're not covered.
Okay.
If that makes sense. I mean,
But we can amend it if something comes up.
So then how do you decide what to do compared to, like, there were things that were done, things that aren't done?
Yeah, so to answer that question, we have our 10-year plan that was done last year, and so I took a look at that. I also worked with Mr. Daly on things that he feels like need to be addressed over the next 3 years, and that's how we arrived at this list.
And if I recall, it's over, is it $10,000 that comes to the
Yes.
board? So over $10,000, it would come to the board for review and would be available to us. But if it's, the estimate comes in under $10,000, we wouldn't necessarily vote on that.
So, all right, this is not clear. So like on number 1 of last year, it said resurface the track would be done in February or March of 2023.
And it was not.
And it was not, and now this year we're listing it to be done in the fall of 2025.
And that was with the discussion with Mr. Daly about that.
So, okay, I guess I still am not clear where these, like, why did we get these dates and then transition to these dates? You know, like was
Because
this date, we
Once
started
again-
with and Mr. Daly said, never mind, I don't want it, wait.
Once
2
again, I
months?
can't answer for how it was done last year because I did not do it.
Oh, this wasn't you.
The 24 one is me.
I have a rough order in my head of the things at my house that need to be done. We're gonna need a new roof and we're gonna need new windows. And I'd like to get the windows before the roof because it'll help with the power bill. But if the roof starts leaking, I'm gonna bump it up the list.
The 23 one was done during the 23 budget process.
Right.
Yeah.
And you weren't here. I didn't remember. I had forgotten. You came right after that.
Yeah.
They
So you
are-
don't know why.
And there's not a, these are placeholders, like Amy has indicated. It's like, these are things that may be coming down the pike, and those things may change. But they're not necessarily booted off the list. Tennis courts didn't fall in the first round. Maybe they'll fall in the next round. Maybe something else of higher priority will come along.
And it all depends upon our money as well.
Yeah.
So,
even the 10-year plan will probably evolve with time, that you're always going to check things off that you've done, and then you're going to add things, or. you're gonna
Right, which
take
that
some
makes sense. I
Yeah, so the capital projects plan,
very
like I said,
confusing why we did not do 95% of it, and the dates
Yeah.
were set to do it 3 months later, yet we obviously
and a lot of
didn't.
those from last year is because of money.
Yeah, so why did it, I guess, anyways. Okay,
I tried
That
hard to
answered
balance
at
the
least
24
sort of.
with things that we know we need to get done. Like we know we need to look at the tennis courts in 24. We've already had discussions about that. I've talked with Mr. Daly about that. I tried to balance the number of projects on an annual basis so we're not spending 1.5 million one year and 200,000 the other year. But I can't guarantee that these things won't change. Because what if we have an emergency HVAC repair that costs $250,000? Well, then I'm going to have to act something else. Yeah.
in some, monthly, we're in communication about how's the budget looking
good.
on a monthly basis, like, oh, well, we're 8 of the 12 months through, what's it look like compared to what we've actually spent? And so we're constantly in communications. And it might be a situation like, well, things are running hot right now, so we're not going to do that project now. That may have been listed. So as Michelle said, we're doing the budget 18 months in advance of actually implementing everything. But on a monthly basis, we're monitoring the revenues and expenditures in education, referendum, and operations.
Helpful,
And
thank you.
facilities, schools are notoriously fickle. It can be brand new and still break down.
And there's a certain pattern to it. It's not like they just say, oh, we're going to go out and get bids and have this done next month. There's a pattern to it in terms of coming to the board, what information is needed, bids, the whole business. And I've seen it happen in the time on the board where we've been down to ready to go for a final vote and something's had to be pulled because something else came in that was a higher priority. So, I mean, it is up until the board votes on a higher expense item, it doesn't exist.
Makes sense.
And I will try hard to make sure that that document keeps updated on our website in 2024 with what we actually do. I will tell you, I actually asked the DLGF rep previously where I came from, And they were like, well, yeah, we don't look at it.
Oh,
You
interesting.
can update it, but we don't look at it. But as you know, I bring all of these projects to you guys to approve. So the public does know what we're doing.
Correct.
Helpful, thank you.
A quick question. So this project on this page, that will be the computer
The
laptop.
equipment, yep.
Yeah, that should be done this year, right? That should be.
Do what?
That project is going to be finished this year, right? Oh, it's still the same as.
The laptop replacement, that's a
Yeah, phone
future,
system replacement, IT network servers. So
that's a
this,
future laptop replacement. We always are having to replace our, I believe that might be for teachers, I believe. And
okay.
then we will have another round of students at some point here as well.
so
And remember,
basically,
this is for 3 years.
so basically these things is kind of 3 years. in-
So I also worked with Mr. Hamilton to discuss a lot of the IT things that need to be done. If you notice, one of the big ones is a phone system replacement. Our phone systems are almost obsolete. And so that's going to be a very large expenditure that we will have probably in the next year or two.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. I just clarify because there's no time here, so I just.
Right. And we don't have to do a time for the equipment acquisition.
Okay, okay.
They're,
Yeah,
they're,
just-
they're different.
Yeah,
The
no problem.
legislators, I cannot explain why they did what they did. So,
Okay, I just make sure that, but anything, anyway, this is on our to-do list, kind of to-do list.
right.
Regarding this, it's kind, I say it's Form 3, right? The Form
Yes.
3?
Uh-huh. Knows the taxpayers.
Yeah, Form 3, so basically, the item, the column 2 is our
That's the
estimation.
actual
What
budget
do we-
estimate that I went over.
You go
for
through,
you.
okay, so that's right, that's my understanding, right? Okay, so the column 3 is kind of from the
The
financial
tax,
department.
that's the property tax.
That's
Yes.
calculated by the rate, right?
That's the high that we're looking to,
Maximum.
yeah.
Okay. Okay, got you. So this number is from the.
Yeah, so these,
Financial.
all three of these will be much lower. So if you look at these numbers and compare them to the fiscal plan, the fiscal plan has what we really think we're gonna collect.
More conservative,
Well, it's what we really think we're gonna collect.
okay,
But this is an advertisement, and so to protect the budget, we advertise those high. But what we really think is gonna happen is in the fiscal plan,
Okay.
on the property tax levies.
And I do promise you, the DLGF does tell you to do that.
Yeah.
oh, okay,
And this is the reason why we engaged Mr. Reuter, why the board made the decision to engage Mr. Reuter, was so that we had a clearer fiscal plan that everybody could review in addition to these high advertised numbers. So
okay.
it was a very intentional hire, and they've been working very hard to get things.
Well, but he's also a genius, so.
Yeah, there's that. Yeah,
I
we've
would
been
vote
working
for-
very
I would
hard to
vote
get
for him for
that.
President, so.
That's right. And for the column 5, that's kind of actual current tax levy. So that's the, what we already collected, or that will be the
But
actual?
those would tie back into the fiscal plan too. Those would actually show what those actually were set at.
Uh,
So let's-
We already collect, or we are expecting the
Yeah,
real?
but it shows the budget amount, it doesn't show what we'll really collect. In other words, we lose a lot of that to the circuit breaker.
But this column 5 is not really the true number, it's
Right,
what
so
we,
let's-
it's still expectation, right?
Yeah, so
Okay.
let's take the operations fund here, it's 4,065,297. I hope it matches.
Yeah, also, yeah, that's right, that's right.
Yes, so you see the 4,065,297.
Okay,
That's the budgeted levy. But right below that, you can see I'm estimating, well, we're gonna lose about 550,000 of that. We're really not gonna collect that. But the
Okay.
DLGF form shows the full amount.
okay, got you.
Yeah.
And so these numbers, this current year tax levy would tie back to the fiscal plan numbers, but we take it one step further of how much we're not gonna collect.
Take the.
Just to put it into perspective for you,
situation.
there's some school corporations that
So
lose
this-
like 80% of
This
their
column will
operations
all
fund.
get reduced and then it'll show up here next year.
That's kind of
This
expectation, the
this-
real expectation.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is
But
high.
in theory, I mean, I calculate that by the rate and multiple by IVs, and then you
Yeah.
can get that numbers.
Yeah,
Okay,
so you'll get, on the adoption, you're gonna get what's called a Form 4.
Okay.
And Form 4, you'll actually be asked to adopt the budget, levy, and rate.
Okay.
For the notice Form 3, we only have to advertise the budget and the levy.
okay,
So, but when you get that Form 4, we're still going to ask you to adopt those higher numbers to protect them so that we can accomplish the goals that we have in the fiscal plan.
Gotcha.
but they will be reduced in what was called the 1782 review. It's the Department of Local Government Finance review. And they bring us back to our 4% limitations. They review the debt, they lower those levies. They then set the final referendum rate. Our referendum rate gets set against then the new AV, but we've advertised even that high here. Just, you can always come down, you can't go up, so we just protect the budget that way.
And once
That
again,
makes
there's
sense.
horror stories from that. I've heard of people that did a typo when they were
Yeah.
filling out their estimated AV on their Form 4Bs. And because they did a typo, that rate was not advertised higher like it should have been, and they lost probably $1.5 million. So we double check those things.
It can be a gotcha process.
Yeah.
Yep.
You cannot go ahead and change that. Sorry, I got typos.
Yeah.
I know of people who have missed entering a debt payment. There's a lot of different things that could happen during the budgeting process. So
Okay. Yeah, I think that's all question I have. Thank you.
Are there any other questions this evening for Mr. Reuter? He will not be with us again, as I understand. Are you done after this one?
Yeah, unless I need to come back for another meeting. This time of the year, I'm
Yeah, you're clawing for calendars. Yeah.
out a lot of nights of the week. trying to
Yeah.
get to
I would
the
always
public
text him,
hearings.
"Are you available? Tell me when."
Yeah, yeah. So Mr. Reuter will not be back with us again. Mrs. Cronk will be, and obviously Dr. Greiner.
You're just stuck with me. Sorry.
Just no apology necessary. Thank you very much for your work, both of you, on this. This is not a simple task, and you managed to make it make sense to us, which is delightful.
If I might add just one last final comment, I would like to thank my staff, because without them, I would not be able to do these types of things, because they take care of a lot of the day-to-day operations. And they're phenomenal people. And thanks to Mr. Reuter, because having him for my first year somewhere, that was big. That's very intimidating when you know what you're doing, but you didn't do it here. And having his historical knowledge for a lot of things was really, really helpful. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Michelle, and I see the presentation today. It's really nice, very clear outline, and for me, you just go ahead and read that. It's much easier, enjoyable.
I appreciate that.
Appreciate, very professional. I appreciate that.
I didn't tell as many jokes as I normally do because I was a little
No, that-
intimidated, a little nervous today. Sorry. Yeah.
No, I think everything's clear outline, and then you do everything professional.
Thank you.
I think that's very, very good. I appreciate it. You do the due diligence and very well prepared, so I appreciate it. So many numbers, complicated, as you said, really complicated. Appreciate it.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and adjourn. It is 7:32 p.m. Thank you.